Welcome to everyone joining this live event. We are waiting for a couple of seconds to get more people into the Zoom, and then we'll get started. Okay, maybe we can get started and more people will will keep joining us for this conversation. Welcome everyone to the Asia launch event of the Digital News Report 2024. I'm Federica Cherubini, I'm Director of Leadership Development at the Reuters Institute, and I'll be your host for today. Today we'll be discussing the findings from the most comprehensive study on news consumption around the world, the Digital News Report, which was published earlier this week. And specifically, we'll look at implication for Asian publishers. I'm joined by Nick Newman, the lead author of the Digital News Report, and by Yvonne Chua, author of the Philippines country page of the report, and Raiko Saisho, author of the Japan country page of the report. We'll start with Nick presenting some of the main findings, and then we'll go into a discussion with our guest. Nick, over to you.
Thank you very much. And good morning, everybody, or good afternoon in Asia. Good morning from London. So what I'm going to do is just talk you through some of the Asian data specifically. So just some of the issues that are most relevant to the countries we cover in the report. As Federica says, the Digital News Report just started in 2012, now covers 47 different markets. And in Asia Pacific, there are 11. You can see them listed there. And this, in terms of the methodology, this is based on online polling. So it will tend to slightly underrepresent traditional behaviors like watching television or reading a print newspaper. But the main focus of what we're doing is looking at digital behaviors. I should also point out that in some markets, in some of the African markets and also in India, we're mainly talking to an English-speaking, more urban audience, so not quite as nationally representative. So when we compare, we should bear that in mind. The report is an independent piece of work. It's sponsored by 19 different organizations. So the main sponsor is the Google News Initiative, but we also have broadcasters like NHK, the BBC. We have academic institutions, foundations as well. So onto the data. And one of the biggest changes that we're seeing right now is what's going on with online platforms. And this is obviously partly linked to artificial intelligence. It's partly linked to changing audience behaviors, but it's also to do with the changing strategies of these big tech companies. And when we're talking about news, one of the most obvious examples of this is what's happened to Facebook over the last few years, where we see this really significant decline in weekly use for finding, sharing, consuming news content. And this is part of a deliberate strategy by Facebook to deprioritize news, to deprioritize political news in particular, and invest in content that it believes will be more engaging for its users. And that includes investing in creators of different kinds rather than necessarily supporting news publishers. So this is aggregate data from a number of social media and video platforms from 12 markets we've been following since 2012. And the other big trend we can see here is the very sharp growth in video networks. So YouTube, you can see at the top, Instagram, TikTok. So this is basically where the growth is going on. And of course, it's not just these networks, but actually Facebook and X or Twitter have also been investing in video. So part of what you are seeing here is shift into video. The other thing that's interesting about this chart is that a decade ago, you can see this was primarily about Facebook. The social media was basically Facebook and a bit of YouTube. And what we see now is just a much more fragmented social media and platform landscape, where there are so many more networks, so many more choices. And what's going on here is that for many of them, as they move into video, the post and refer model that media has depended on is becoming severely diminished. So people are less likely to click a link out. The platforms are competing amongst themselves to keep the traffic within those platforms. And that's really challenging for publishers. So this chart represents 12 countries, including Japan, but mostly sort of developed countries. But we are seeing, across Asia and many other parts of the world, we're seeing the trends, if anything, even more starkly. So if we look at these declines in Facebook, in the Philippines, 11 percentage points down this year, still absolutely huge in the Philippines, of course, Facebook, so it still remains really important. Malaysia down 8 percentage points, Singapore down 4, Thailand down 1. And then conversely, you have this rise of TikTok and the video platforms, and you can see in all those markets very significant increases this year. So just digging down a little bit more into TikTok, I think what's really interesting, and I've just picked out some of the Asian markets, that the percentage of people overall who use TikTok for news is 13% across all of the networks, all of the countries that we cover. But if you look in Asia, in many of those Asian countries, it's much, much higher. And in fact, the top 10 are all in the global south rather than in Western Europe or the United States. So that's kind of interesting in terms of, and that's partly, I think, because of younger populations, but it's also partly because of the way in which people really embrace video in many of these countries, which we talked about last year in our report. And you can compare that on average with, say, the UK, only 4% say they use TikTok for news. Obviously, younger people are using it a lot more than that, but as part of the general population. We look at YouTube. YouTube, of course, is bigger. 31% use YouTube for news, but we see the same pattern with much higher use in many parts of Asia. So this video trend is particularly relevant in many Asian markets. So lots of change going on in social and video networks, but the question is how important is that, and how important is it to publishers? So this is a question we ask about how you access news. So what's your main way of accessing news? And first of all, if we look across all of the markets we look at, so there's 47 markets, not just Asia, you can see that for over 35s, direct traffic, social media, and search are pretty much equal. So some people prefer go directly to a news website or app. Some prefer to go via social media and search. Mobile alerts, aggregators, email, of course, are also important. If you look at under 35s, you can see how different the picture is. So the younger generations, many of whom have grown up with social media, this is the default. This is where they spend most of their time. And you can see they're about three times more likely then to go directly to a news website or app. So this direct connection with news brands is much harder with that younger generation if you're trying to reach that younger generation. Excuse me. So what we see if we look across different countries is in Northern Europe, for example, the preference is still to go directly for a lot of people. You can see in Finland and Norway, Denmark, even the UK. But if you look at some of the countries in the global south or in Asia, you can see much more likely to go via social. You can see there Thailand. And then in other countries in Asia, particularly, you have some very powerful aggregators, often local aggregators. And so most people are accessing via, for example, Yahoo News in Japan, or maybe by Naver in Korea. Yahoo is also very important in Taiwan, and various mobile aggregators in India. So this sort of this aggregator or search portals are much more important in some parts of Asia as well. And that, of course, is important because it makes it much harder for many of the media companies to really build direct connections and businesses off the back of it. So I mentioned aggregators. I think one of the themes running through this year's report is artificial intelligence and the way that is now infusing so many different products on the internet. And mobile aggregators in particular are trying to personalize that content and using AI increasingly to do that. We see some in the US, for example, like Newsbreak doing that, which originally founded by Chinese entrepreneurs. And then you have a lot of Asian aggregators that are also incorporating AI recommendation algorithms, for example. And I think that's going to be a much bigger part of the picture going forwards. So I've already alluded to this, the rise of online video. Let's just look at that in terms of the detail. Again, really, really high levels of usage of short form video. That's obviously TikTok, but it's more than that. It's Instagram Reels, it's YouTube Shorts. Long-term form video, live streams, very significant proportion of people say they access that weekly, much higher in many Asian countries, as you can see there, and lower again in many Northern European countries. What's interesting is the differences when you say, okay, which platform are you using to access the online video? It is different in different countries. So we can see that in the Philippines, we've already seen that high use of Facebook. Facebook video is the number one, but YouTube has been increasing. So again, you can see that sort of that gap narrowing between the two. In India, it's primarily around YouTube. YouTube is really the absolutely dominant way in which people access video. Indonesia, it's YouTube, Facebook, and TikTok is incredibly strong in Indonesia. And then in the US, also YouTube. What's interesting is on the right-hand side there, you see a Northern European country where many people are consuming the video on the platform itself, on the news website, and that's because of this strong direct connection that many of those Northern European countries still are able to have. So lots of differences. Why do people consume online video? Some people just think it's more authentic and trustworthy because it's coming directly from ordinary people. So this word authenticity comes up a lot. Videos from Gaza, for example, taken by somebody who's actually living there feels more trustworthy. The short nature of it, it's really convenient, it's really quick, and the algorithm is personalized. It tailors it to your personal interest. And then just the range of things that you can get information on. So it's not restrictive like much of the news is. It's much more inclusive. It's tailored to your personal interests, as we said earlier. So this year is a really big year for elections around the world. Record number of elections, and it comes at a time of rising concern about misinformation of various kinds, including AI-generated fakes and the potential impact on our democracies. Overall, in our data this year, we find that almost 6 in 10, 59% across all markets say they worry about their ability to tell what is real from what is fake on the internet when it comes to news. And that has increased for the second year in a row, so up 3 percentage points. We find that in Asia, the number is slightly higher than the average, but we also see there are bigger increases in some of the countries that are holding or have held recently elections, such as in the US, in South Africa, and in India too. And this comes as online platforms are being affected by AI videos, AI imagery, synthetic content of different kinds, which has just become so much more photorealistic and much harder to detect. In our qualitative research this year, we found many people had come across this, particularly sort of younger people who were heavy users of social media, and they really worried about their ability going forward to tell what is true and what isn't. And I think this issue of seeing is believing has been at the heart of trust on television, but also online. You can believe it if you see a video of it, or you can believe it if you see a picture. And if that starts to break down, I think that has huge implications for trust. For the first time this year, we asked about specific platforms and the extent to which people found it easy or difficult to identify trustworthy news in each platform, and this is of users of each platform. And what we find is that people have the most concern about TikTok, they have the most concern about Twitter, and of course, both networks have been implicated in spread of misinformation in a number of recent elections and other types of information. That's not to say, I mean, also interesting to see here that many people actually find it quite easy to tell the difference, or say they do at least. So it may be that people are digitally more savvy than we think. So that brings me on to we ask about AI and misinformation, but we're also interested in the way in which the news industry itself is now incorporating AI into its workflows, either for efficiency or to try and increase the relevance of the content. And we gave our respondents two scenarios, which were starting to emerge right now in the news ecosystem. The first one is where AI is creating the content itself. So this might be an AI bot that is writing a news story from text that it has, for example. Or it may be where an AI bot is answering a query that you ask it in voice or in text. In this particular case, we see that in almost all cases, people are much more uncomfortable with this than comfortable. So there's a lot of sort of inherent fear and suspicion about AI technologies, getting it wrong. Only 10% say they're comfortable in the UK. In Japan, similar low levels of comfort, a little bit higher in the United States. And then the second scenario is one that many media companies are really getting stuck into, which is that the AI is being used behind the scenes in helping the journalists and supporting them either with research tasks or translation tasks, or maybe helping with copy editing. And in this scenario, in almost every country, people are more comfortable than uncomfortable. It's interesting that Japan is one of the exceptions. So people are just naturally suspicious of these technologies. Anyway, we can pick that up perhaps in the discussion. But a very significant story here, I think, in terms of audiences really wanting humans to remain in control right now, particularly when it comes to important subjects like politics or international conflicts. So that brings me to the issue of trust and trust in the news in general, which has remained actually quite stable this year. Maybe one bright spot, it has been going down in many cases in many countries, but overall, across all countries, 40%, 4 in 10 say they trust most news most of the time. If we just look at a few countries in the region, we can see there are many reasons why media is distrusted. A lot of it is seen as a lack of independence, but it's also related to polarization. We see strong polarization in countries like the Philippines, for example, contributing to low trust, even for brands that are trying to hold politicians to account. The opponents of those, the supporters of those politicians then quite often blame the media for things they don't like in the media. In Japan, actually very little change, but maybe a different story, which we can pick up on. There's been a number of scandals involving media coverage, so maybe that has contributed. Interestingly, in a number of countries, we see a significant increase in trust. In Malaysia, for example, around COVID, and that seems to have been maintained since around 2020, 2021. And similarly in South Korea, where traditionally it's been one of the lowest trust in our survey, partly because of this perception that the media is often not fully independent from powerful business or from politicians. This year, we asked for the first time people to tell us which are the most important factors in defining whether a media outlet can be trusted or not. And what you see here is a consistent picture across countries, across ages. And I'm just showing you here the Asian data. But the most important things to ordinary people are transparency and openness. So in other words, lack of bias, being open about the way in which you've covered the news and how you've got to the story that you've got to, high journalistic standards, ethical standards, and standards of accuracy, a lack of bias, and being fair to different groups. So it's pretty clear what it is audiences expect from the news media. And if trust levels are low, it's largely because the people feel that the media is not living up to these ideals. So these are sort of areas that the media, if it wants to rebuild trust, needs to double down on things like transparency and openness and high standards. So just a couple of other headlines before we get into the discussion from this year's report. So one of the data points that we look at every year is the extent to which people online are prepared to pay for news or not prepared to pay for news. So with online advertising under strain, more publishers are trying to get readers to pay directly, to charge for news through subscriptions or memberships. And we're looking at 20 countries, and the proportion that say they're prepared to pay for news remains pretty low. So it's a minority in every country. But in some of those Northern European countries, you do see, significant proportion paying. In countries like the UK, only 8%, in Japan, only 9%. So it's a small proportion of people who are currently paying for news. And we find this year that many of them are paying at discounted rates as well. So it's and the percentages have not really changed over the last couple of years. Over the years, we've found that a few upmarket brands, maybe financial brands like Nikkei, for example, in Japan, have been able to build strong subscription businesses because people are prepared to pay for a certain kind of news. And organizations like the New York Times, for example, have managed to extend that lead over others, such as the Washington Post, by bundling in games and more value into this all-access subscription. So that's one of the trends that we're seeing. And then we're also seeing a lot of smaller, low-cost organizations or individuals starting to be able to charge for something that's really valuable to people around politics, technology, business, etc. So, there is definitely some bright spots. So that's the pay. And then in terms of engagement, this is a story we've been telling for some time now, since 2017. We find that increasing proportion of people say that they sometimes or often avoid the news. So that was 29% in 2017. It's now up to 39% across all 47 countries. And the reasons for that are that many people feel that the news is too negative, it's boring, it doesn't feel relevant to their lives. And, wars in Ukraine, wars in Gaza have contributed to that sense of lack of hope, of lack of a sense of powerlessness. Here are a few quotes from India, which is kind of reinforcing some of the trends that we hear every year, that they feel overwhelmed by the amount of news. There's too much to consume, and it's depressing. It damages my mental health. Concern about trust, which we've heard about already. A lot of it's unreliable or exaggerated. And this sense of confusion. The news is everywhere. The news is in social media. It's very fragmented. I'm just confused about what is true and what isn't true. So these are some of the challenges that people feel in this sort of very fragmented and complicated, increasingly complicated information space. So just to summarize some of the things we've talked about so far in this year's Digital News Report 2024. So firstly, this uncertainty in the platform environment, this real sort of reset that we're seeing, means that it's going to be much harder for publishers to rely on traffic from social and video networks or even from search. And the big question is, how will media companies survive? How will it build traffic, build advertising revenue? Can it reduce that dependence on specific platforms? Video formats have been on the rise, particularly in many Asian countries. But a lot of the challenge of that is that the consumption is within somebody else's platform. So how can the media connect and get proper attribution or even financial return if it's creating content within somebody else's platform? How can it compete with influencers and others in that space? In terms of AI, audiences we find are generally skeptical, more in some countries than others. But they do have a strong sense that they want human beings to remain in control. So how can publishers get the benefits of AI without losing trust, which people are really worried about? Asian audiences are worried about misinformation, as in other parts of the world. Is that actually an opportunity for traditional media organizations to rebuild that direct connection? And then in terms of, lack of engagement, this trend we're seeing towards more people turning away from the news, can we sort of think differently about what our products are, about the content itself, about the way in which we package it to make it more engaging for users? So a few of the key points from the digital news report, and I'm very interested to hear how that is in some of the countries in the region. You can download the full report and the slide packs from our website, digitalnewsreport.org. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick, for this presentation. And now looking forward to this discussion with our experts. For the participant in the Zoom, there is a Q&A function in Zoom. So if you have any questions that you want me to ask the panelists, just put them in there and I'll try my best to ask as many as possible. So one of the main headlines is this fact that this platform reset, right? This fact that like some platforms are changing a bit their strategy, or even more looking away from news, and the fact that this link economy on which many of publishers had based their relationship with readers is even more fragmented, is declining even more. In Asia, platforms have always played a bigger role than maybe in other countries. Yvonne, what is the perspective from the Philippines on this? Like, are we seeing even more? We saw the sharp decline in Facebook, even if it's still important, and TikTok on the rise. Tell us a bit about what you're seeing from the Philippines.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Social media, as you pointed out, has a fairly secure hold in Southeast Asia in particular. In the Philippines, Facebook has always been the leader as far as the platforms are concerned. But I think Facebook also has to watch out, because for the very first time since the Philippines was included in the survey, this is the first time that they've actually seen a very significant drop. When we were included in 2020, Facebook had like a following of at least people turned 73% turned to it for news, and that that stayed pretty steady throughout the years, except over the past year. And of course, Nick mentioned the platform reset, where there's less visibility now of news accounts or news or news on the platform itself. So that, I think, primarily that's one thing that Facebook has to take into account, plus the fact that the Philippines has a very young population. Our median age is 25, and a lot of them are really turning to alternative or other social media platforms, including TikTok, where we've seen a very significant rise, not just from 2% in 2020 to 21% now among all the age cohorts, but among the youth, it jumped like from 3% to 30%. So we will see, I think, a lot of shifts, especially as we move into another election year next year. TikTok made really its presence felt during the 2022 elections, and a lot of catching up had to be done by the news organizations. I'm sure there would be a lot of rethinking going on. One thing I also want to point out, however, is I noticed that, and this is perhaps something to watch out for too, is Threads, or the federated universe, is something that we should be on the lookout for. And I think some of the news brands in the country are anticipating that. So some of the leading brands like ABS-CBN and GMA, they've already established a presence on Threads, kind of predicting that this is probably another platform that would gain traction in the coming years.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. Reiko, Japan has a very aggregated news environment, with aggregators playing even a bigger role than in many other markets. How have you seen things evolve in the last year in this context of platform reset?
Yes, Japan in generally, changes happen very slowly. So we hardly ever talk about Threads yet. We just embrace these things step by step, slowly. So compared to last year, YouTube is flat, even X is flat. Only a large kind of increase is seen in TikTok, and also in line with what we see in the international oil market, Facebook is losing its steam. That's the only two things I think we see in Japan that matches the trend overall when we compare it internationally. But as you say, when it comes to highly aggregated market, when you look at average, the average disguises the changes happening underneath, because when you break it down to age components, the social media has already taken over aggregator. I think 2 years ago, that kind of the point where you see social media taking over in that age bracket, and that will not, I guess, would not reverse. So it is posing hard questions to one's almighty aggregators that has dominated the media scene for the last decades. And maybe one thing that shocked me was because Japan has so many earthquakes, we used to believe that the emergency broadcasting or emergency information kind of transmission is the traditional media, because we cross-check and we are seen as being reliable. But nowadays, young university students just check the earthquake data through social media. So even in that last area that the main news traditional brands were strong at, social media is penetrating, I think.
You mentioned changing is slow, and some of the publications are also slow to adapt to these changes. However, given this switch in between aggregators and social media access amongst the younger generation, have you seen publishers or individual brands thinking more in this area, like investing more in social in light of this change, or is still kind of waiting to see how much this will really sink in?
They haven't really launched a massive campaign, but I do see a change in the atmosphere about how the traditional media organization discuss about their relation with the aggregators, because they are more kind of they're speaking up with regards to the data they have or how much money they get through the platform. As for the social media, it varies from newspapers to newspapers. Some newspapers who are more outward going has their individual correspondents tweeting more proactively. Some organizations like us, we've been quite cautious, and that remains to be at the moment. So there's a kind of disparity between the brands.
Nick.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on something that Yvonne was saying about TikTok. So I think in across Asia and in other markets, we do see a lot of variation in the extent to which media companies are getting involved and really trying to create short form video and engage with young people. But one of the things that surprised me in general is the way that we see politicians almost doing it more quickly than that. So, Yvonne was talking about the Philippines. We've also had in Taiwan, the Taiwan's People's Party really emerged as a third force this year in the elections. And their leader really connected in a big way on TikTok and was part of it. Last year, we saw a similar phenomenon in Thailand. And then in Indonesia, President Subianto had an amazing TikTok campaign where he kind of rebranded himself as a hardline general, a hardline general, as a cuddly dancing grandpa in TikTok with AI avatars alongside it as well, and really going for that direct connection. We've seen similar things in Europe too, in the recent elections. So I think it's interesting, if media companies don't go in there, engage with, reliable news, then the populist politicians will go there and do the same.
Yvonne, picking up on this, so the rise of video formats and more video-led platform like TikTok and YouTube. YouTube is very strong also in the Philippines. How can media connect with these younger audiences in these networks and compete with influencers? What is the perspective that you're seeing from the Philippines on this?
I think there's it's among the big brands, there is really a recognition of the threats, right, coming from the platforms, the sort of user needs and all. And so you see them respond rather easily. The ability to personalize content or to repurpose content across platforms is something that you could expect from the big brands, especially the leading brands such as GMA and to a certain degree ABS-CBN. But it's something that also that we're keen about or we're aware of is the other brands, including newspapers, radio, the traditional platforms, print and radio, have not been as fast to catch up with that. So that is actually a source of concern, especially in terms of the production of video. There have been efforts, I have to stress, among media development institutions to build the capacity of Filipino journalists to produce news videos, especially shorts. And that's something that we have to be really, I hope the latest survey findings would serve as a wake-up call, because although globally we saw that shorts account for like 2/3, right, of what are viewed in the Philippines, this is a really hefty 80%. So people, news brands, to make themselves more relevant, to be accessible, they really have to adjust the way they're doing their storytelling.
Thank you. Another big topic, maybe the big topic this year in the news industry is, of course, the rise of generative AI and its adoption by news organizations, more or less front-facing to the audience or in the background. And indeed, we look at this in depth in the Digital News Report. Reiko, we heard from Nick that aggregators are really jumping into this personalization and using AI very much in this context. What are you seeing from news organizations? Is there the same sort of like rush into figuring out how to incorporate AI or generative AI in the production, or still slow on that?
Are you talking about in the news production?
Yes.
Oh, yes. I think because the shortage of personnel and cost-cutting pressures are always here in Japan as well. So companies, including the traditional ones, are trying to embrace AI if they can. But at the same time, it's not like one leap into just doing the whole thing. It's just slowly testing. But Nikkei, the parent company of FT, has made it clear that they are doing summary reports when it's, if it's a figure of the profit of the company, and that doesn't really need a human judgment, they would use it in order to cut costs and efficient. And also the public broadcaster, which I work for, has also AI automated reading news kind of session, but we don't do it with the main important news, but rather like weather, or I'm not saying weather is not important, but if it's already a format and you really can't go so wrong in it, those news we are using the AI. But I think there was a discussion about the sensitivity of reading serious news about like COVID death by a machine, and that's the one point NHK pause a little bit and start contemplating what are the content which is suit for AI, and what are the things that the human has to still be in control, even if it takes up a lot of time and energy.
Yeah, and we saw also in Nick's presentation that Japan seems to be more suspicious than other countries in using AI with a deeply involvement of humans. Yvonne, what are you seeing in the Philippines on this in terms of the attitude that audiences have towards the use of AI?
In the Philippines, the leading network, GMA, unveiled its AI sportscasters last year, Marco and Maya, and it really received mixed reviews, mostly negative. People worry about job displacement, about why use AI in a field that's so packed with emotions and energy. So it's something like apparently it is, we're not quite, the journalists themselves aren't quite ready for that yet in terms of for certain fields. However, I must say that quite a number of newsrooms, not many, a handful of newsrooms have been using Gen AI to repurpose their, let's say, text to video scripts or text to audio scripts. I've seen that quite a lot during my talks around the country. And there's also, like, in terms of summarization, you've seen, I think Rappler has done that, and Inquirer to a certain degree has also done that. Sometimes my own concern about this has to do with the need for human oversight, because it's very easy for journalists to say, like, okay, this is generated by AI, Gen AI, so therefore the caveat is if it's anything wrong, that the blame goes to that. But I don't think we should renege on our job to still vet what is produced by Gen AI. A very interesting development, and has to do with Gen AI and this year's report, digital news report. Like, one of the newspapers actually produced a summarization based on the DNR. And then there was a YouTube channel that produced a video also based on this year's report. And it was interesting, not as, I mean, the inverted pyramid might be absent, but it's there. However, there's one thing that I was pointing out to Nick and Raiko and the rest of you earlier was, I also wonder if people who aren't that good in math maybe should ask some help from people who know math, or even ChatGPT, because I came across a number of news articles written about this year's report, digital news report, where they got the numbers wrong. I mean, some journalists really can't tell the difference between percentage points and percentage difference. So maybe AI there might, come in handy.
Nick, are you worried we will read the digital news report from a Nick Newman avatar next year?
It is moving so fast. It's hard to know how the digital news report is going to be reported next year and how many humans will be involved in the process. But I think there's definitely the cost pressures, the business challenges are really focusing minds of many media companies, and that's really what they're trying to work out is, can they, essentially, and this is obviously the real challenge. Can you deliver, are some people just going to cut the costs, and that will reduce the trust in media companies even more by automating things? Or do you believe in the distinctiveness of human journalism, and can you sell that as an alternative to all this synthetic media that's going to flood us? And that's the dilemma. And unfortunately, I think we're seeing both. So we're seeing some companies who are, we are seeing both. It's not fortunate or unfortunate, but some media companies are really trying to focus on a future where humans are in charge and AI makes things more efficient. Others are just basically creating loads and loads of content in the hope of making a little bit of money and trying to cut costs. And we're going to see both of those trends this year.
I wanted actually to ask you, Nick, something specifically on that. So you say that one of the reasons why people seems to appreciate video is this feeling of authenticity. Of course, you feel you've seen something and that's what it is. Well, we know that's not always necessarily true, because already there is a lot of choices in editing you can do even with live video. But specifically in a context where we'll see, or we will be able to see more and more synthetic images and synthetic videos created. Do you think this link between feeling a video more authentic will be at risk in an AI generated environment?
Yeah, I think as others have said already in this discussion, it depends on the context and the content. I actually feel that if you're talking about weather reports, as Reiko was doing, the ability to personalize that and to create a short video around weather that is really, really useful and relevant is something that's very hard to scale at a human level because all the local possibilities. So that's a really good place to use AI, and with relatively low risk. So many media companies are thinking about this high risk, low risk. If you're talking about empathy, humanity, longer form connection, building relationships. I think all of that is going to remain human. So I actually do think that we will have, very short form news, very short form weather, which will be much more automated and synthetic with avatars. And I think there'll be a big space for human journalism as well. But it's certainly going to look quite different in 5 years' time, I think.
If we remain on this topic of authenticity, sort of leads us quite neatly to one of the other big headlines in the report, which is the concern around the levels of misinformation and more generally trust. So misinformation concerns remain very high, especially in Asia, with many really struggling to feeling that they know how to tell apart what's true and what's fake for on the internet. Riker, Asian audiences, as we said, are particularly worried about this. Is this an opportunity for traditional news organization to fill this gap?
Well, that's, I think, precisely what public broadcaster like ourselves are trying to do. Fake news and disinformation may not have been as kind of uppermost in people's mind like in United States or in Africa, in Japan, because again, we were ring-fenced by languages. But ever since Gen AI came in, suddenly this huge interest in terms of what we should do, intervention in terms of misinformation and disinformation from the government and NGOs and media outlets. So there has been a lot of conversation happening in the last 6 months. And obviously, as a public organization or traditional media, I think we have some capitals that we can use to tell people that we have this long-running tradition and expertise on verifying things and explaining how we got there. But again, have we been transparent all the time is something, again, another challenge that we have to embrace. So I think there has to be a conversation about how media organization can be and should be and will be transparent in explaining their work, which is still at a very early stage, I think.
Riker, sorry, Yvonne, all of this, what Riker was saying is even more complicated in the Philippines, given the extreme polarization in the country and how issue like trust has really been weaponized on the side, on one side. What is the opportunity here for traditional organization to reclaim this trust in such a complicated environment?
This is not an election year in the Philippines. So the fact that 63% of Filipinos still are concerned about, what is fake or real online it's an indicator that all is not good in the Philippines. Politics remains the leading topic that concerns Filipinos the most, where they see false or misleading information. And I guess now with the breakup between the president and the vice president recently, just yesterday, Filipinos worry all the more that there could be disinformation or unfolding, especially as we head towards an election year next year. I think the China's increasing aggression in the Philippines over the territorial disputes has also greatly concerned us because of the growing volume of influence operations engaged by China. Of course, China has a different story. It says that the Philippines is engaged in influence operations. So with all that, I think one thing that stands out in the Philippines would be the fact that fact-checking journalism itself has gained some foothold, unlike in some other Southeast Asian countries. Like, it's certainly not Singapore, of course, Malaysia or Thailand. But outside of Indonesia, really quite a number of newsrooms in the Philippines are very conscious about the need to counter disinformation, whether it is through fact-checking or explainers or other means. I think one of the things that the Philippines is also pretty much ahead among newsrooms is we pioneered Thanks to Internews Philippines, we've gone into like training journalists or building their capacity to also monitor and detect influence operations, both domestic and foreign. So this is, I hope that this would help assuage the public's fear about the newsroom's inability or ability to help them filter what's real and what's false.
In this, I wanted to close with a question about news avoidance and news fatigue. There are some markets like what you just described, Yvonne, which is very challenging on many different levels. And much of the world news is not necessarily happy and uplifting, with so many news about wars and challenging environment. And there is, as Nick was saying, we've picked up for a few years now that some audiences, even those that are following the news, do choose to disconnect at time because of this overwhelming feeling of negativity. How do our products need to change to really make an opportunity out of this challenge? Yvonne, what are newsrooms in the Philippines doing to kind of, and are they doing anything to kind of find a way out of this news fatigue and disconnect?
A lot of the newsrooms, I think, are in search of answers, like how to respond. I think that's the $64 question facing every newsroom across the world. In the case of the Philippines, this is a real issue, especially news avoidance is higher than the global average. I think it's like news avoidance is still like 47% compared to the 39% globally. But I just like to point out that this year's report, Nick, I hope you don't mind, but Nick did point out that this year there was an interesting question that they included, and this is about user needs. Whether it fills your needs in terms of your knowledge needs, filling the gaps in understanding, in inspiring you, or in connecting you. And the global finding shows that, of course, across all markets, people still, of course, want to stay updated. They want to gain more knowledge about topics and events. They want to receive more perspectives and get practical information. In the Philippines, the top three answers are the same. So gaining knowledge, getting practical information, and of course, staying updated. But the fourth answer was a bit different. For the Filipinos, the fourth answer was they want actually newsrooms to place greater emphasis on news that makes them feel better about the world. So I think it's something that we should look into, like without sacrificing all the rest. Is there one way, especially in a highly polarized, divisive society like ours, where all sectors are pretty much like divided? Maybe that's a need that we should also look carefully into.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. Very, very important point on that. Raiko, what is the approach in that newsrooms in Japan are taking or thinking about to try to move past and re-engage some of these audiences?
Well, again, there's no answer, but I do see a bit of change in the recent years about, for example, serious talk about diversity, having more female on the higher position. And also there are niche programs where the podcasts where people talk more about their emotions and feelings and about their kind of issues in a more plain language, not the news that we produce with a square kind of rather patronizing manner. And those podcasts, although it's niche, gain traction. So I guess there is some element that we are not actually, I mean, the traditional media company like us is not still picking up. And so by kind of investigating or going into those areas, hopefully we can produce somewhat different forms of news, which is more contextualized and people understand the narrative and feel more close to whatever is going on. Compared to the other countries, we take this fairness doctrine or the objectivity principle very, very seriously. And I keep on hearing from my friends who visit Japan that our news is still like something like 1980s, 1990s UK. So I guess hopefully there is a room for us to develop something new to tailor, to cater the needs of the changing audiences. But that's just a very early stage, I must admit.
Thank you so much. Actually, a question just came through the Q&A, Reiko, for you, saying on comfort using AI, the proportion of people answered not comfortable is lower in Japan compared to the UK and the US. Although humans intervened, they're not comfortable yet. Does this mean that Japanese people do not trust the journalists in the first place?
I don't know. I always find trouble reading Japanese data when I do the Reuters Institute's kind of when I file a report, because there's so many people who chooses, I don't know. We are a country who just feel, I don't know, very shy or cautious in setting our opinion, yes or no. So there's a huge vast of people in between, and that's very shady as to how much they are against or whether they are pro. So I guess I would have to look into the components of the age and the usage or trust in order to understand what that in between people actually suggest. And maybe it might be that they don't trust journalists, but I guess I would have to look into that.
A phrase that we love at the Institute in research meeting is more research is needed. So for sure, it's also the case. Nick, I just wanted to close. I know we're close to the end of the conversation. Yvonne mentioned the user need chapter, and you look into that. Can you tell us a bit more on that? What did you look at specifically this year around the user need, and where is the gap and the opportunity, crucially, for newsrooms?
Right. I think we've heard a number of perspectives on this issue of lack of attention and what we do about it. And it's a very complicated issue. There isn't a single issue going on here. Reiko was talking about maybe we need to make the news simpler. And for many people, they are confused by the language we use, for example, and so sort of simpler news. We wanted this year not just to talk about the problem, but to actually sort of outline what people felt was important. Where were the gaps? And one of the areas we did find gaps, Yvonne, was in this area, particularly with younger people, about wanting news stories that made people feel better about the world or gave people a sense of hope, particularly around issues like climate change, for example. And this sense that the media always had this negative lens, was always putting things through a negative lens, looking for the worst in humanity rather than sort of trying to emphasize things that were going well that we could build on. And this is particularly true with young people, but it's a trend that we see generally. And when we did the analysis of the data, we felt this is one of the areas that the media really could do more with. And around the world, we're seeing a lot more sort of constructive journalism, solutions journalism, stories about inspirational people, and a lot of this is sort of beginning to work. So I think there's a lot of different problems in news avoidance, and I think the overall message is the media should not just do positive stories, right? It should focus on holding people to account, on telling people what's happened, but it also needs to do more than that. It needs to provide the context. It needs to help with those educational needs to make people feel smarter. It needs to make people feel better as well as worse about the world. It needs to reflect the world as it is. And I think we've just sort of uncovered, and we've talked about today, a lot of gaps currently which need to be filled.
Thank you so much. Indeed, it's a very challenging environment for news publishers around the world. But I was very pleased, and in our discussion today, we were able to highlight also opportunities and strategies that news organizations are looking at or starting to look into to make an opportunity in some cases out of these challenges. Thank you so much, Yvonne, Reiko, and Nick, for joining this discussion, and to all you that are following online. You can find a full report on our website. We're also doing a series of podcast episodes where I interview the authors of each chapter to help us understand a bit more in depth some of the issues covering the report. And do check out the Philippines country page and Japan country page and the other country pages in the report if you want more information about your own market. Thank you so much for following. Thank you again to our speakers, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Goodbye.